Hello? Great. I think I'm live, but I'll just do a quick check. Excellent. So I'm sure this thing's working. Thanks for having me. I'm talking to you about judging today and managing BP panels, which can be quite challenging. So I have some suggestions for how to come up with a productive and meaningful discussion in the panel. All right. So first, let's talk about judging in BP. Why do we even have to do this? Why is it important to try to standardize our practices in judging, right? It's important because participants have a right to know what to expect when they are speaking in front of judges. A predictable standard of judging ensures a fair competition. And it also protects you as a judge. Because if you adhere to judging standards and judging guidelines, and some participants will be unhappy. Losing is always unpleasant, right? It becomes easier to defend yourself by saying, look, there's a standard that we are holding you to. I did not just make up my reasons for why you won or you lost. So judging standards, judging criteria are there to protect both parties, right? The participants know what they are being assessed on, and the judges also know which standards to apply and how to defend their decisions based on those standards. That's why these standards are very, very important, especially since you're dealing with 4 teams. And sometimes it's a bit difficult to compare. All right. So in a nutshell, how do we characterize which teams win debates? Like if we can describe in one sentence which teams are effective or which teams should win, what would that sentence be? I think it would be the team who wins is the team who would most persuade an average reasonable voter of the merits of their side through making logical and relevant arguments, right? So logical and relevant arguments. And who are you persuading? Not a specialist, but an average reasonable voter. We do have a small set of rules that exist to facilitate a fair debate, right? So a lot of the things that we think are rules are not necessarily rules. So for example, if someone wants to integrate their rebuttal and their constructive, that's completely fine. If someone wants to construct first and rebut later, that's completely fine, right? So some things are convention, but there are a few things that are like required for teams to do. And the reason we have these rules is it's a question of fairness. Sometimes teams will do certain things that are persuasive, but are unfair. So we don't allow them to do that to make the format fair. So for example, if the opening government team only revealed their model in the second speech, this is really, really unfair to opening up, right? Because they just have one more speaker to respond. Or if the member of opposition did not deliver an extension and then the opposition whip comes up with the extension, this is unfair to everyone else in the debate because they don't get a chance to respond. So that's why we have rules, to ensure fairness in BP. Now, and we'll talk about those rules in a little bit. The next thing I want to mention is, so you see in the motion, this House believes that, right? So who is the House exactly? There has to be a House, right? So the House does not always have to be the government. If there is no actor specified, then it's probably reasonable to believe that the House is like everyone, a global community. But sometimes the motion will specify specific actors, right? And that's fine. It can be a group of people, it can be a country, it can be an individual. So for example, sorry, I will just kill my messaging. All right. So for example, the motion is this House, as China, would hold democratic elections on the local government level. So the motion is about China, and your burden is to demonstrate why it is in the interest of China as the actor in the debate to do this, right? But if there's no actor specified in the motion, then you are obliged to demonstrate the level of generality of the motion. So you don't get to narrow it on your own. If the motion is a general motion of this house would ban cosmetic surgery, you assume that all countries are doing this, or most countries are doing this. You don't get to say, in the Philippines, we will ban it because we have a big problem with sexism in the Philippines, right? That's not fair to your opponents. And usually, if judges want it to be narrowed to a specific country or a specific actor or a specific group of people, they will indicate that in the motion. Otherwise, debate the level of generality of the motion. Now let's talk about definitions. I think it's important to believe that the vast majority of debates are actually defined legitimately. Most people want good and clean and clear debates, and they do their best to define motions as fairly as possible. A good question to ask yourself when assessing whether a definition is fair or is legal is it a reasonable interpretation of the words in the motion? So I have actually been in a debate where the motion was, this house would legalize prostitution, and it's defined as prostitution means sacrificing your principles for material gain. So we are okay with countries in the global south entering into free trade agreements with developed countries. And obviously, this is not a legal definition. This is not a reasonable interpretation of the words in the motion. Prostitution has a fairly specific legal and technical definition. That's what the debate should be about, right? So if a team tries to define terms that are not within the spirit of the motion, are clearly a distortion of what the words mean, or if they try to unfairly restrict it to a specific period in history or a specific place, then yes, you have the option of challenging them for this. It doesn't mean you should challenge all the time. Like sometimes it might make sense to just keep debating it. In fact, it might benefit you sometimes. But if you would like to challenge it under those circumstances, that's fair. Remember that a problematic definition is different to a problematic argument. If you have problems with the arguments, then just respond to them, right? If your problem is with the definition, so ask yourself first, do I need to challenge this? Because it's impossible to have a fair debate. And if so, then yes, you may challenge the definition. Very briefly, for judges assessing definitional challenges, only the leader of opposition can issue the challenge. If the leader of opposition doesn't challenge, then that is the definition for the debate, right? And you cannot step in and impose your own definition on the teams. You can't even punish the opening government for not defining it the way you want it, unless the definition later on creates problems in the debate. So if LO doesn't challenge, then that is the definition. I want that to be very clear. If leader of opposition challenges, you need to look for the following. First, they need to explain why they're challenging, on what grounds. Next, they need to provide an alternative definition. So they need to say the Prime Minister failed in their duty, so this is what they should have done. And after that, you need to debate against that alternative division, the definition that they've provided. They need to debate against that alternative that they've provided. And a lot of times you will have parallel debates and you assess them based on the quality of the arguments they make, the internal structure of the arguments, the level of substantiation they've offered for these arguments that are not like relating with each other, interacting with each other, because they could be very different debates. And usually these are bad debates because they're not comparative. So as a judge, you ask yourself, is the challenge valid? And after that, judging the individual arguments being made, which arguments are superior or more cohesive and more well substantiated. What about the closing themes? So in the event of a challenge, this is one instance where closing gov is allowed to contradict their opening theme if they think the challenge is valid. So they can say, we support the challenge, we are going to debate O's definition instead. They can also choose to just go with their opening government's definition, but they need to explain why. And closing up has the same privilege. So hopefully this is a small minority of cases that you will encounter most of the time you do have debates where everyone is debating the same definition. All right. Now what about clashes and burdens for teams? It's important to emphasize that teams have equal and opposite burdens. So do not hold one team to a higher standard than another team, right? So if the debate is about a policy or about a perspective or a narrative or a worldview, right? The opposition side also has a burden to say that something is better or less harmful than their policy, than the proposition's policy. So obviously they will be explaining that the proposition's policy is problematic for a variety of reasons and why it doesn't work. But they have to show that on the comparative, their world without the policy or with something else that is exclusive to the policy is a better world or is a less harmful world, right? So they still need to come out on a net positive or show that the other side is a net negative. If opposition is not explicit about what they're defending, it is fair for a judge to assume that they are implicitly defending the status quo, or at the very least, they are implicitly defending a world without what the prop is defending, right? The opposition can also bring up a counter model, and as a judge, you compare their counter model versus what the proposition has provided, and assess them based on how well they've defended this counter model, using the same standards that they've used to assess proposition's model. At the same time, the burden of the opposition side is to clash, right? And so their overall position must be mutually exclusive to the proposition. So for example, we have a motion that says this House would make voting mandatory. The opposition side that says we believe in voter education laws and spend all of their time defending voter education laws are not clashing on a mutually exclusive way, because the proposition side can also have voter education laws, which means opposition must spend more of their time explaining why voter education laws are enough and compulsory voting is not okay, right? Finally, teams do have fiat in debates. So the proposition side is allowed to assume that what the motion states will happen. So for example, if the motion is this House would secretly fund a Rohingya army or a Rohingya liberation salvation movement in Myanmar, opposition cannot come up and say, no, the world will never agree to do this, because that means a debate can't even happen in the first place, right? You have to assume that the world will do it, and then you can explain why it's a bad idea, why it makes future good things harder to do. All of those arguments are fair and possible, but you need to assume that the motion will happen. That's important for a debate to actually happen. All right, and as a judge, therefore, opposition arguments that say this will not happen fall out of the debate. You're supposed to recognize that the proposition side has fiat in as far as saying what they want to happen will happen. Of course, it's not always going to, the benefits will not necessarily accrue. They need to prove that. It's not necessarily going to be effective. They need to demonstrate that it will be effective. But they are allowed to assume that it will happen. In terms of consistency between teams, so I'm sure you've all heard of the term knifing or contradiction, right? So closing teams have a duty to not contradict their opening teams, to stay consistent with their opening teams. However, they do not have an obligation to defend every single argument made by their opening team. They're allowed to distance themselves from certain arguments as long as they don't openly contradict them. And even if there's an open contradiction, as a judge, you just ignore that material because you assume that the opening team, you assume what the opening team said to hold for the debate. And anything that is said after that directly contradicts that can just be disregarded. But make sure that it actually is a contradiction and not an even if argument. and that, it cannot exist in the same world as opening government's case. But don't hold too high a burden for contradictions. If it's not even contradicting a major part of opening government's case, it might not be that consequential in the debate. And even if it was an actual contradiction, so this is a technical error because the rules say that they should be consistent with their opening theme, but you should weigh this against the mistakes made by other teams in the debate as well, right? So it's not an automatic fourth. We do not have automatic fourths in BP. So let's say this team made this mistake. You assess this mistake relative to other mistakes that were committed in the debate. The next is points of information. Taking at least one point of information is a rules-based issue in BP, unless none are offered. So if no points are offered, it's not the speaker's fault, right? But if a speaker doesn't take any POI and there were POIs that were offered, this should be seen as non-responsiveness and penalized accordingly, right? So POI should be treated the way we treat matter, which is one of the two criteria we use for assessing teams. So good and bad POIs can help and hurt teams. And POIs are a way of demonstrating engagement in the debate. Later on, we'll talk a bit more specifically about how to assess POIs. The next contentious thing is extensions. So based on the rules, closing teams can only gain credit in a debate for the new things that they bring to the debate. If it's not new, then they can't get credit for it because that's unfair to the opening team, right? At the same time, new contributions can occur in various parts of the speech. So the extension doesn't just come out in the constructive parts of the speech or the arguments part of the speech, right? New things can also come out in rebuttal, in POIs, in the framing, in the weighing mechanism for the debate. So as a judge, it is our responsibility to identify and to recognize where in the speech of the extension speaker and the whip speaker do these new things occur. Of course, it would be ideal if debaters flagged to us always when they were bringing out new material or new things, but they don't always do this. Nonetheless, as a judge, we're not monkeys. We have an obligation to recognize it when it's there and to give credit to it. Okay, so as I was alluding to earlier, extensions can take many forms. So what are examples of extensions? So an opening team might have asserted an argument and provided a reason for why it's true. If the closing team provides a new reason or a new justification for why that same argument is true, that's still an extension. Or identifying a distinct impact of an argument already made by the opening team. Or a new rebuttal of a key argument from the other side. A new framework for looking at the issues. Completely new argument. So all of these are possible forms of extension. Sounding nice is not necessarily a winning extension. So also ask yourself as a judge, obviously the closing team has had more time to prepare, so they're probably going to be a bit more eloquent. Their word choice is going to be more precise. And of course, language and like word choices and the use of rhetorical devices matters in making arguments more persuasive. Like certain examples matter in making arguments more persuasive. They're also part of good manner. But ask yourself, how much newer is this material? And yes, sometimes it can be an extension, you give it credit, but is it enough to win over the opening team is another question entirely, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit, pretty soon actually. Finally, another contentious issue is new material in whip speeches or summary speeches. Summary speakers are not allowed to raise new lines of substantive argumentation. This is a fairness issue because it limits the ability of other speakers to engage. Does this mean they are useless in the debate? Of course not. They contribute to the debate, just in a different way. So they can introduce new rebuttal because they're responding to extension speakers, right? They can introduce new examples even new analysis of an existing argument, for as long as these do not change the argument so much that it is clearly not the same argument anymore that you heard in the extension speech, right? If it's an argument that you do not recognize as having come from the extension speaker, then it is quite likely to be new material. But what do you do in this situation? You don't necessarily punish the speaker for it. You just disregard the new material. Because if you punish them, then you will be double counting, right? You'll be doubly punishing them for it, and that's a problem. Instead, by disregarding it, by you disregarding it, they've already been punished because they lose precious time to respond to the other side, to use that material to introduce arguments that can actually introduce ideas that can actually further their case, right? So opposition whips receive no credit whatsoever for new material. Even if it's really, really good, unfortunately, that's unfair to the teams in the round, so you're supposed to disregard it. Proposition whips receive diminished credit for it, but are still to some extent allowed to insert some of it because the opposition whip can still respond. Okay, so we've covered the contentious issues in judging, so we've covered them thematically. Now let's talk about, and this is a more advanced level, the process of judging itself, like what wins debates. So again, I just want to remind you of our key sentence earlier, right? The team who wins, the team who persuades the average reasonable voter of the merits of their side through making logical and relevant arguments. And we'll unpack the meaning of all of these words. What is an average reasonable voter? What is a logical argument? What is a relevant argument? Okay, now let's talk about the process of judging. Good judging is not simply about counting violations of rule fulfillment. So you don't simply say, you were under time, you over-rebutted and therefore did not have enough time for your extension. Oh, you took POIs quite late. Like, we don't use these standards to justify our decisions, right? We're not accountants. You're not using a penalty-based judging mentality. You're using an issue-based judging mentality. The only time you start using the rules is when it becomes a question of fairness. But even then, it's not enough to tell the team, your model was unclear, therefore you lose. You need to explain how the unclear model hurt their case, or why, because their model was unclear, you were forced to give the opposition side the benefit of the doubt in terms of their rebuttal. So when you're citing a technical flaw of a team, you need to explain how that weakened their case. It's not enough to just say they lost because of that flaw. Now, as a judge, you take the position of an average reasonable voter who is also like an informed global citizen, right? What is this average reasonable voter? So you are someone who is impartial, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So you're someone who's impartial, regardless of your personal beliefs or opinions about the motion. You go into the debate with an open mind and believe that either side can win. So you set aside your own biases and your own beliefs. If you are a specialist, you disregard your specialist knowledge, right? So you don't pre-rebut the points of teams because you happen to you happen to have a legal background or a medical background or an economic background. You insist that teams engage with each other's arguments as much as possible, not yours, not the debate that's in your head, right? You also don't complete arguments for teams as an average reasonable voter. So even if you've heard this argument before, or this is your favorite argument, it's an argument you would have run if you were in the debate, that's irrelevant. You don't complete it for the debaters. If it's a popular argument in your debate circuit, or you happen to know that example because you're familiar with it, unless the debaters explained it, you shouldn't be filling in the gaps for them, right? Okay. Now, in terms of allowing teams to engage, in terms of judging based on letting teams engage with each other and interact with each other as much as possible, it's important to realize that there is no duty for teams to hit or to rebut every single argument from the other side, right? Sometimes this simply isn't possible. But it's important for them to be able to challenge and take down or attempt to take down the major claims of the other side. So when assessing issues, you need to be able to explain why certain issues were more important than others, why certain responses were more important than others. And again, just like extensions, even if teams don't explicitly label something as a rebuttal, if it is responsive, if it is a rebuttal, then as judges, you can consider them as responsive claims, right? You just don't pretend that there was no rebuttal. If there was one, it just wasn't flagged clearly. Okay, so that's average reasonable voter and the mentality that judges have. Now we talk about what is relevant in a debate. So how do you tell what is important in a debate as a judge? And this is this is particularly crucial because a lot of times teams will not just disagree on what's true. So you're lucky if in your debate teams have the same goals or the same values, right? So teams are like, oh, let's talk about the protection of women, period. Or let's talk about the protection of minority groups, period. That's great. But a lot of times they won't even agree on the goals or on how the goals should be measured. So even before we get to the individual arguments, there's already a disagreement on the criteria, on the metrics for who wins. So they will not just disagree about what's true, they'll also disagree about what's important. What do you do as a judge in this situation? I think it's important to judge importance and relevance on the following basis. First, if teams agree on what is true and important and they're explicit about this, that's good for you. That's good for the debate. It's clear, right? So you just use the standard that they gave you, that they agreed on. Next, if there's no direct, clear, explicit, or straightforward agreement, the next thing you do is, what do they seem to agree on? So what seems to be the implied agreement? Make sure that you are understanding it correctly. Make sure you are not making stuff up for teams or filling in gaps. And maybe they're not saying it explicitly, but based on the amount of time they're spending on this argument, based on the conclusions of their argument, they seem to agree that a certain set of outcomes or a certain set of values are important, right? So first, what do they explicitly, directly agree on? Second, what do they implicitly or seem to agree on is true or important, right? So if you have either of the first two, this is actually a fairly easier debate to judge because teams seem to agree on what the standards are. Now, what if that doesn't happen to you or in your debate? The third thing you might want to do is, well, what did one side prove is important? If no one was successful, then which team was on their way there the most, right? Like which team got the closest to proving that what they were arguing was important or that their worldview was important, right? Assuming you don't have any of those three, assuming it was such a mess that the teams didn't even seem to know what they wanted or what the end game of their arguments was, then ask yourself, what would the average reasonable person think is important in this debate? And remember, you're not asking what you as given your personality and your specialization and your background would think is important. You are trying to figure out what the average reasonable voter would find important, and that's what I use as a standard for judging the debate. But before getting to number 4, you have to carefully check if 1 or 2 or 3 is possible first. And remember that importance is always relative. So given the same motion in one room, you might have mostly non-consequentialist arguments. In another room, you might have completely practical arguments. In a debate, you could have both. You as a judge shouldn't make any prejudgments about which kinds of arguments are more important, right? Let the debaters battle it out for that. Okay. Next. So comparing teams on the same bench, which I think is quite difficult. I think it's very easy to compare teams that are directly across from each other because they get a chance to directly respond to each other, right? But I think it's quite hard to compare teams on the same bench or teams diagonally. So on the same bench, the first question you ask yourself is, did the closing team have an extension? And this is where you identify the new stuff that they said. And you don't just find it in the constructive, you check their rebuttal, you check their POIs. Perhaps they gave the POI first and then opening gov made the argument, but they still deserve the credit for making making the point in a POI, right? So first ask yourself, is there an extension? What is the extension? And then ask yourself whether the extension is sufficient to win over a team ahead of them on the bench, right? So usually it's not enough that the opening team set up a good debate, right? The total contribution of both speakers should have been persuasive too. But at the same time, if you have an opening team that has a well substantiated case, then the mere presence of an extension or minimal additions from the closing team to a well-proven case already in the opening half shouldn't be enough to win over the opening team, right? So the mere presence of an extension doesn't mean you win over the opening team. So the next step is to assess which set of arguments were more central to the debate based on how they were argued by the debaters, not how you feel about them personally, but how both teams proved that these arguments were more relevant to the round, right? And the level of substantiation and analysis that they offered for the arguments that they presented. All right, now comparing teams diagonally, which is also quite challenging. So they're opposite sides, but not across from each other. So OG, CO, OO, CG. The first thing to remember as a judge is the top half teams cannot respond to the bottom half teams. So it's really unfair. Even if you don't mean for it to come out this way, a lot of judges tell, I've been in situations where judges tell the opening team, well, you didn't respond to what CO said. And I'm like, yes, because they can't, right? So that's probably not how it should be explained, even if that's not what you meant. So there are some things you can look at, right? For example, POIs are quite useful in this situation. If the top half team gives a lot of POIs to the bottom half team, how does the bottom half team deal with that? The quality of engagement of the bottom half. So we have to make sure that they actually hit the important stuff that the top half teams came out with. And we should go back to our notes as responsible judges and diligent judges. We go back to our notes and we ask ourselves, were these major arguments actually responded to? Or did the closing team simply insist that they've responded to them, but not really? We are allowed to credit material in the opening speeches, which is implicitly responsive to material in the closing speeches. So of course, the opening team will not have an opportunity to directly flag it as a rebuttal. But if you take into account their material, put it side by side to the material you got from the closing team, and you're like, actually, this answers a lot of what the closing team is saying, it's fair to do that. You must not make new arguments from the top half teams. You must not complete them, but you can reasonably interpret and apply their existing contributions. Otherwise, it's really unfair. Like, they'll always lose, right? Just because they were rebutted doesn't mean they lose right away. You need to ask yourself if the rebuttal persuasively took down the argument. Otherwise, the opening team could still be ahead, right? So it doesn't mean that an argument is rebutted, it has fallen down. We also need to assess the quality of the rebuttal. And so at the same time, if an argument falls down quite quickly, then maybe the argument wasn't robust enough, right? So you can also tell the opening team, your argument wasn't preemptive enough, wasn't layered enough, wasn't analytical enough to withstand like very basic attacks from the closing team. So even if you didn't have a responsibility to respond, if you didn't have an opportunity to respond to the closing team, the way you built your arguments in opening half was also like inadequate. And that's why closing half could easily take them down, right? So that's a fair way of explaining why an opening team would fall behind. Or maybe that the closing half identified the more important issue in the round and they were able to explain why it was the more important issue. Might be another reason. All right, so we've done comparing teams. Now let's talk briefly about manner. Manner should not be counted separately. So as an average reasonable voter, you don't say, oh my God, I make them win because their policy was a bad idea and it was proven in the debate to be a bad idea, but they sounded nice. That really just makes no sense. Usually you take these two things into account together. Manner contributes to the argument being more persuasive by virtue of the examples used, by virtue of the emotion used, by virtue of the word choice, and rhetorical devices that are being used, but ultimately it can't be divorced from content. There are many acceptable forms of manner, and this is important because no one style of manner is superior, and speakers should be given the freedom to experiment with different styles. Some things are quite universal though. Language that is overly simplistic or overly technical and highfalutin are both like ineffective. Clear and simple language is usually quite effective. Another thing is rudeness or over-aggression or inappropriate tones or very high speed of delivery or inaudible delivery. These are all forms of manner that are unpersuasive. And as judges, you are allowed to comment on the use of manner in justifying. Okay. Here are a few other questions that people might have, and then we'll move on to having productive discussions in panels. So one question people might have is, as a judge, what happens when a team is shut out of a debate? What happens when other teams simply don't respond to their case or don't engage with their case? So as a judge, ask yourself, are they shut out of the debate because they didn't understand what the debate was about? Like, is it their fault? Were they a closing team that came in there and ignored everything else that was in the debate and just brought out whatever they felt like saying? If that's the case, then perhaps they are at a disadvantage. But if the other teams are just ignoring them for convenience, then they probably don't deserve to come forth, right? Especially if they made a clear, compelling case. Especially if they made a clear, compelling case for why their arguments are important. What if debaters are lying or they disagree on the facts? So as a judge, try your best to not intervene on the truth claims being made in the debate. Unless it's obvious to the average reasonable person, you shouldn't be rebutting the teams. Ask yourself instead, if there's a factual clash in the debate, which team tried to prove that their factual assertion is plausible, right? So let the teams fight it out. If they both are not proving it, then find another issue to resolve the debate on. How do you evaluate examples? So it's important to recognize that examples are forms of substantiation. But examples are only valuable if they're well analyzed, right? If a team gives you a shopping list of 20 examples without explaining any one of them, and another team gives you one well-explained example, the second team might be better off, right? So examples need to be compared with the quality of substantiation that's offered in entirety in the debate. So if a team provides like logical and systematic and step-by-step analysis, but doesn't have like many examples, and a team might give you the names of 3 examples that they don't discuss intensively or extensively, then that doesn't mean the team with examples necessarily wins, right? So the quality of substantiation still matters. Finally, let's talk about panels and how to have a discussion within panels. I think part of this is a mindset thing. It's very important to remember that you are not trying to win in a panel discussion. It's not a competition. It's a conversation that you are having. The goal is using everyone's brain and everyone's contribution to come up with the best, fairest set of rankings for that round, right? So your goal when you enter the discussion is to have a productive conversation, not to like force everyone to judge the debate the way you did. You need to be open to persuasion also, right? It's also not about like bargaining and horse trading. Oh, if you give the team I wanted to go first, I'll give the team you wanted to go second, even if I think they were fourth. That's not how it works, because the rankings need to make sense to you, right? There needs to be a plausible flow for you for why the rankings ended up that way. As a chair, it's useful to start with an initial call, so see where everyone else is initially. Compare notes, focus on where you agree, and then you just firm up those agreements. So if you all agree that opening government is fourth, talk a little bit more about that so that you're fair. So each team deserves to be talked about. Never dismiss teams, right? Sometimes you might start by thinking they were fourth, and then after your discussion you realize, oh, actually they're not, right? So give every team a fair shake. So focus on your areas of disagreement and solidify them. If you don't change your minds, and move on to your areas of disagreement. Usually in those situations when there's disagreement, what I just end up doing is, let's compare the teams directly across each other because that's easy. So let's compare OO and OG. Let's compare OG and CG. Let's compare OO and CO, CO and CG. So it's just easier to do that versus diagonals, and then revisit the diagonals or compare where the rankings you feel are closest, right? How do you do these comparisons? Sometimes the disagreement is a result of confusion about what was said in the round. Sometimes it's a result of judges weighting what was said differently. So as a chair, you need to be able to diagnose that problem. Like, what is happening here? Do we even agree on what was said in the first place? So usually, what I would suggest is you start, if it's contentious, you start with an audit of what was said, right? You go, actually, let's go through all the things that we got from opening gov. So let me try to summarize what I got from them. Is this a fair summary? Did I miss anything, right? And then let's go on to closing gov. Usually, in the process of doing an audit of summarizing the material that we got from teams, someone will realize that they missed something or that they misunderstood something. Usually that already resolves a lot of things. If it doesn't, then at least you all are on the same page about what the speaker said. Then you just disagree on how you evaluate what was said. And then you can have a discussion on that level. But it's always good to check that you are on the same page about what you got from the speakers if you're disagreeing. And in the absolute worst case, then you can call a vote as a chair. But that should be your last resort. Okay, excellent. So I think I'm done with my stuff, and we have 10 minutes. So if you guys have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Maybe, Claudia, you can just, the speaker scale. Okay, I think what we can do is just put up a copy of the speaker scale on the page and maybe on the desks for each judge. So I'm not going to go through the speaker scale in depth now, but I think what I'll say about the speaker scale are a couple of things. The first thing is, a speech doesn't have to meet every single description in the band for it to fall within that criteria. So for as long as it generally meets the description that's provided in the band, then you can score them within that range. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, don't be afraid to use the range. You have 4 teams in a round. It's very possible that there will be a big difference between the best speaker of the debate and the last speaker of the debate. So be fair to the teams and use the range, right? Compare it against the band, not against your idea of what a 75 is. Third, apply your standards consistently. So if you gave a 75 in this debate, and then in the next debate you see a speech that is better than that 75, then you should be scoring that speech higher, right? So you need to be consistent in your application of the band, but also your application of your own standard. What else about the speaker scale? So use the range. Don't be very dogmatic about the bands. Apply your standard consistently. Do people have any other questions? I'm just gonna check with Claudia. What do you mean by fulfilling brackets? So this part isn't very clear to me. I think the priority should be the difference between teams. So score them fairly. So don't try to think... I'm not sure that I'm understanding the terms in the question very well, because the question is, should you prioritize difference between teams or fulfilling brackets when it comes to speaker points? So, you know, if it's a team in a low, quote-unquote, low-point room, but you happen to have a team that did very well in that debate, you should give them above average scores if you think that they were very good. But Claudia's clarifying the question, so I can be sure that I understand it correctly. Okay. I think you should score speakers based on how their speech corresponds to the speaker scale. So even if you think this was a good team, if for that debate the speeches don't correspond to what you initially thought, based on the speeches they delivered in that debate and not any other debate, then you should just score them based on the speaker scale for that debate. I'm not sure if I answered the question. I hope I did. And if there are any other questions, I'm just gonna wait for Claudia to post them here. Okay. And of course, if you have any other questions, please just send them over to my Facebook inbox and I'll try to respond as soon as possible. Good luck for your tournament. Bye guys and good night from here.